Hey everybody, Pastor Chad here with a bonus Q&A video for you. I'm sitting here working on the sermon for Sunday, and man, I just hit a point where I'm like, I need a mental break. I need to go for a walk. And on my way out, we saw a question come in that it's not related to any one of the sermons in our Ask Anything series, but it is related to a question that was asked. It just didn't make it into the top 5 or 6 questions. And so I thought, man, this would be great to address in a full-on Q&A video. So thought this would be a good mental break for me, might help you. We'll see. Here's the question. Can I ask a question that isn't directly related to the sermon? Can you explain 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15? Now, I'm going to invite you to just pause this video right now and go read those verses. So go Google it, grab your Bible, but read them so you'll understand what comes next. Are you back? All right. Kind of intense, I know. Now, here's what the question asker asks. Doesn't this contradict what we've been taught about Adam being at fault in the garden as well because he didn't protect his wife? And how is Adam, quote, not deceived? It seems like this verse puts all the blame on Eve and then says a woman's only source of redemption is through something her body can do. This also seems to contradict that we are saved through faith, not our works, i.e. childbearing. Okay, so that's a great series of questions. And so I'll just answer them one at a time best I can. The first question is the broad one. Can you explain 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15? And I laugh not because that's a bad question. That's a great question. I laugh because that's maybe the most controversial and debated passage in the entire Bible. And so I can't explain the whole thing right now. I'll give you a general answer to your general question, then we'll get into your specific ones. In terms of the general answer, here's what I'd say. I know it's a difficult passage at first blush. If that wasn't difficult for you to read, you need to read it again. There are two primary ways that Christians today understand this difficult passage. The first view, which is maybe the more traditional view, says that if you read these verses in the larger context of 1 Timothy, what you will see is though they seem difficult to you and me, these verses are intended to give us wisdom for how we would operate within the church and to make much of Jesus in the world today. And so though they seem difficult to you and me in isolation, when you read them with the surrounding verses, what you'll see is there's a larger argument going on. And when Paul says that a woman should remain silent, he doesn't literally mean silent because that would contradict so many of his other letters where he commands women to prophesy and pray and get in the game. But he's talking about a particular type of speech that he is saying none of that kind of thing happening. And if you read it in context, you'll see what it is. So the first view would say these verses are for us today. And though they seem shocking, when you put them in context, you will see that there is a life-giving design from God that would lead us into life if we would lean into it today. That's the first view. The second way that Christians understand this today is some Christians would say, no, the reason those verses sound difficult is because they're not for us today. Those verses were written about specific women in a specific church in a specific city called Ephesus in the first century. And based on chapter 1, where we learn there's false teachers in the church, what people holding this view will say is those women must have been the ones doing the false teaching. And so when Paul says he does not permit them to speak, he literally means don't let them talk at all. They're false teachers. They're causing nonsense. And so the second view would say these verses are not directly for us today. Maybe there's some principles and wisdom we can glean about how to deal with false teachers, but they're not giving any instruction for ongoing gender roles in the church that would lead to our flourishing. It's simply limited to the situation in Ephesus in the first century. And so those are the two major ways that Christians would understand those verses today. And when I say Christians, I'm talking Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christians that are seeking to let the Word of God guide our lives. And what I will say is, as I've studied it, I find the second view is difficult to maintain in light of the larger context of 1 Timothy. And I also think that this view maybe overstates some of the evidence of the roles of women in the ancient world and what was going on in Ephesus. It just makes a lot of assumptions. And so I'm inclined towards the first view that seems to do better with the historical evidence, better fits the context of 1 Timothy, and frankly, I think better fits the context of the Bible. But like I said, you'll find Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christians on both sides. And so for you, I would say you just want to dig in and say, God, what are you saying here? And maybe grab a great study Bible and study it for yourself and see how God leads you on those verses. But those are two faithful interpretations, two major categories, and everyone's on a spectrum between those within faithful, Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christians. The last thing I'll say on this is actually, if you're interested in digging into this more, I wrote probably a 20-page paper on this in seminary with 30 footnotes. It's nerdy, but it will get you into talking more about those arguments and why would someone believe either side. I kind of represent both sides and then share more about why I land here. But if you wanted to read more, you could email us at the church at info@fairoaks.org. Just put in your subject line, Chad's 1 Timothy paper, and I'd be happy to share that with you. But like I said, it's nerdy. It really gets into it, and that might not be your ideal thing. A study Bible might be better for you. I would encourage you to study these verses with the Lord and in community with Jesus's people. And I think he'll guide you. That's been my experience as I've been really wrestling through these verses over the last couple of years and still trying to really think about how do we most faithfully apply this today to have a church with thriving men and women working together to make much of Jesus. So that's the general comment I'd make. Let me speak now to your specific questions from there. Let's see here. The next question says, doesn't this contradict what we've been taught about Adam being at fault in the garden as well because he didn't protect his wife? How was Adam, quote, not deceived? It seems this verse puts all the blame on Eve. So what I would say is if you read 1 Timothy carefully, you'll notice Paul never says that Adam did not sin. All he's doing is focusing specifically on Eve's actions without denying Adam's. Because he's not interested in talking about Adam's because he's making a specific point in this context. And again, that's not to deny what Adam's done. If you read, the book of Romans, particularly chapters 4 and 5, Paul has some sharp things to say about Adam's actions in the garden as well. But he's making a specific point here, just like he's making a specific point in Romans chapter 4, and they don't contradict one another. He's just not preaching the whole Genesis chapter right now. He's making a specific point. And when he says that Eve was, quote, deceived, or that Adam was, quote, not deceived, that's a faithful representation of the events of the fall that we read in Genesis chapter 3. You can go look it up. You'll see Eve is the one who has a conversation with the serpent. Eve is the one who gets deceived, who believes that God is holding out on her. And Eve is the one who decides, who chooses to violate God's command to eat of the tree that God said not to eat. And then she goes and then she gives some to her husband who is also with her. So when you read it in Genesis, you'll see both Adam and Eve sin. And so I think it would be it's important to say the Bible emphasizes both Adam and Eve are responsible for the fall. If your understanding of Genesis chapter 3 is Eve messed up, and if there were just no women around and all a bunch of dudes, we'd be fine. I think you need to rethink your hermeneutic and get out more and meet more people, because men and women equally share in why this world is broken. But Paul's making a specific point in 1 Timothy, and what he is saying is Eve's sin is an act of commission, where she actively does something that she knew she wasn't supposed to do. She talks to the devil, she's deceived by the devil, and let me also say this. Paul is not saying that Eve was gullible or stupid. Some people have made that comment on those passages. I think that's just a misunderstanding of what's going on. If you read Genesis, you read that the serpent is more crafty than any other creation God has made. So Satan is a very old spiritual being, and so it's not like Eve is dumb for being deceived by him. What it's saying is that Eve was the one who entered into a conversation with the devil and was deceived by him because he's tricky, he's smart. She fell for it, and she became the transgressor when she ate through deception. Her sin is one of commission. She did something she was not supposed to do. Adam's sin is one of omission, where he doesn't do what he was supposed to do. So when God says to cultivate and guard the garden in Genesis chapter 2, if Adam were doing that, you wouldn't have the devil in there. He would have kept the snake out. When God says to cultivate and guard and build up and protect his wife, man, if Adam were standing there next to Eve when she starts talking to the devil and he was praying with her, loving her, serving her, supporting her, partnering with her, that conversation wouldn't have even happened. But because of Adam's sin of commission, that left room for Eve to be on her own, to be picked off by Satan, and through her Adam's sin of omission, that left Eve on her own. And when humans are on our own, Satan loves to pick us off. when Eve's on her own, she commits a sin of commission, where she is deceived and she takes of the fruit and she eats. So that sin of commission is what Paul's zooming in on in 1 Timothy 2. Again, he'll talk about sin of omission. Go Romans 4, 5. It's also in Genesis. But all that to say, just because he's talking about the one here does not deny the other. So hope that makes sense. The Bible doesn't say this is all Eve's fault. It says it's Adam and Eve's fault. And frankly, if you go to Genesis 3, God comes to the man first, which that could be a whole Q&A video on. But no, the Bible doesn't let Adam off easy, and Paul doesn't either if you read his wider work. Again, if you just read those verses, I could see why you would land there, but you got to read them in context. And then finally, we get, let's see here. So this verse puts all the blame on Eve. It then says a woman's only source of redemption is through something her body can do. This also seems to contradict that we are saved through faith, not our works, i.e. childbearing. This is why I was really eager to film this video, because there are two ways that Christians have understood that last verse, verse 15, about being saved through childbearing. And these do not map neatly onto those two major ways that Christians understand the larger passage that I described earlier. But you'll find people in each of these ways that land in either of those prior views. But let me just tell you the two ways people understand verse 15. The first view is some people understand the childbearing to refer to Jesus. If you look back in Genesis chapter 3, when the fall happens, God curses the serpent and he explains consequences to our first parents, which I think that's cool, by the way. God curses the devil, but he explains consequences like a loving father to us because he's gracious and he loves us. After he explains the consequences, what he does is he makes a promise. He says, I'm going to send one through the offspring of the woman that will crush the head of the serpent, that will undo the work of the serpent and restore what has been lost here on this day. And so the first view says, yeah, Eve, she believed that promise, and she will be saved as she believes that promise and continues to have children, waiting for the Messiah to rise up, to destroy the devil, to redeem God's people, and to restore Eden on earth, heaven on earth again. And so the first view sees that Christologically, that Eve is literally saved by having children that have children that have children, that eventually from the people of Eve, the Messiah comes. And so we are saved by salvation through faith alone, because Eve trusted in the promise, kept having children to the point where Jesus comes and is able to save us by grace through faith, and it's awesome. So that's the first view, that verse is actually about Jesus. I think that's a really beautiful and fascinating way to look at verse 15, and that's probably the more common view, particularly in church history among the church fathers. What I will say about that is I think that is maybe getting a little too cute with the text here. And what I mean by that is if you read it in the larger context of what Paul's doing in 1 Timothy, it just seems like it'd be random that he's making a random Jesus reference there right in the middle of his argument. And so that's possible. That's one way people have seen it. The other way people see it is just within the larger flow of 1 Timothy, what Paul's saying is that women will be saved not from sin, but more saved from trying to find their identity through their own beauty, which is the prior verses, or through taking a role that God hasn't called them to, which is the following verses, and possibly, depending on where you land on 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15, what those verses are about. And so again, if you take it in context of the whole chapter, 1 Timothy 2 begins by saying, hey, I want men and women everywhere to pray and to lift their hands in worship to God and make an impact in this world. And what Paul will go on to do is say, and he'll speak specifically to men and women. He'll say to the men, and hey, you can't lift your hands in worship if you're lifting your hands in violence with one another. So stop beating one another up. You can't love God if you're hating your brother. And so knock it off, fellas. And then he turns to the women and he says, hey, you can't be caught up in prayer and love of God if you're caught up in how you look today. And so don't find your identity in your looks or how people perceive you on the outside. Find it on the inside and how God perceives you. So that's what he says in 1 Timothy 2. And then we get to our difficult verses where the first interpretation would hold. He's saying, don't find your identity in the role you hold in your church. You're a daughter of the king. You're gifted to serve. You're making an impact in the world. And you don't need some stinking title of elder to be valuable. God's doing great things through you. And so don't reach for something that's not yours. Embrace what God has given you. And that, under this view, is what verse 15 is talking about. She will be saved through childbearing. She will be saved not from her sins, but from the terrible burden of trying to produce an identity for herself through her beauty or through her role. She will be saved from that threat through receiving what God has uniquely given to her. And the example Paul uses is childbearing. Now, I'm going to argue, if you hold this view, this is probably where I land. He's not saying that childbearing is the only thing women can do. Gosh, that'd be a bad interpretation that doesn't fit Paul's wider writing, nor the scriptures. But he's giving one specific example of something that only a woman can do. Because in chapter 3, he's going to go on to talk about something that only men are called to do in the church. And so at this pivot point, he's giving an example of something specific to women, that this is your superpower, that God has uniquely given this to you. And when you embrace what God has uniquely given to you, for example, childbirth, then you'll be safe from trying to find your identity through your role. When you receive your identity from God by grace, through faith, it'll save you from trying to produce that identity on your own. And I guess I would just want to say, man, question asker, I don't know where you're coming from, but this doesn't say you have to have children or use your body to be valuable to Jesus. The larger principle is that Jesus has given you an identity. He has called you daughter. He has given you spiritual gifts to use for his kingdom. And if you have children or not, is you lean into whatever that specific calling is for you, you will find freedom. And if I could just give an example from a woman in my life, Karen has given birth to 2 children. She has played a remarkable role in our family, superpower, things that I cannot do. But that is not all she does in our family. She teaches, she leads. I mean, she leads out in some significant ways. She does that here at the church, in our community. Some of you are seeing her sing on Sundays. Again, this stuff is tip of the iceberg, but all of those are within the unique calling God has given her. And so the second view would say, Paul is using an example like childbirth to say, lean into what God has uniquely given to you instead of reaching and trying to have something that God hasn't given to you, and you will find life in that. So wherever you land, those are 2 different ways you could read the last verse. But the big idea of the entire section, particularly that verse, is we want to be a church that prays big prayers and lifts our hands in worship to our great God, King, and Savior, Jesus. And we're going to do that as we get rid of distractions and lean more fully into what God has given us. And so study the passage, see how God leads you there. But at the end of the day, wherever you land, whatever view, we should be a church that can unite together. Because your view of this passage, A or B, is not a salvation issue. This is something Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christians can hold differing views on and still work together to reach the world. And that's the kind of church we want to be. So with all that said, thanks for the question. Man, keep sending them in. Sunday, I think there's going to be lots of follow-up questions, lots of great dialogue we can have. And so please do send your questions in, and we'll take them from there. See you Sunday.